Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today, game number 6, 2016 World Chess Championship. So far, 5 games, 5 draws. Sergei Karjakin playing the white pieces, looking to make something happen different than a draw. So he starts out with the white pieces against Magnus Carlsen, pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight to f3, knight c6. This looks like all the other games so far. Bishop to b5, pawn to a6, bishop back here to a4. Knight to f6, having a little bit of deja vu. Castle on the king side, bishop to e7. If you're curious if this is game 4, no, it's just all the exact same moves. Pawn to b5, bishop back here to b3. Castle on the king side, pawn to h3. Bishop e7, pawn to d3. And then we actually see our first move that's different than game number 4. And up until this point, the players have used about 60 seconds of time because they're going so fast because they've already played this game before. Now, usually from white, if he's playing this pawn to h3, this pawn to d3, that's kind of the anti-martial opening because sometimes you may play pawn to c3 as the main line, and then your opponent plays pawn to d5. Very sharp line from black, giving up a pawn to material, a gambit here where the pawn could take. All of a sudden, the knight takes. Knight comes up here, takes that pawn. Black is giving up those central pawns for an exchange and attack. He opens up the lines with bishop to b7 if he wanted to. Could take, but really that's not what he's going after. But he could take, if the rook recaptures, bishop here to b7, opening up the door for some attacking lines on the king side of white. Although white's up in material, a lot of players, if they're playing white, especially at the top level, they try to avoid these lines. And so you'll see things instead of that pawn to c3, pawn to h3. You'll see after bishop to b7, you'll see pawn to d3. Magnus Carlsen saves us a little bit and says, okay, we're not going to play the exact same game. I'll try something a little bit different. In the previous game, he played pawn to d6. In this particular game, he played pawn to d5. So playing almost that or playing the martial attack in an anti-martial opening. And Karjakin immediately responded with pawn takes on d5. Knight takes, the knight up here on e5, and then knight to d4. So this is kind of the first, I would say, somewhat tech that you could tell Magnus Carlsen prepared for this. He's not spending any time on his moves. And Karjakin immediately plays knight to c3. So there wasn't tons of time thinking about these moves. So it looks like Karjakin actually studied and prepared for defense against this. I guess if you're going to be playing tons of that Rai Lopez, you need to be aware of what your opponent could do here. Then over here to b4. Bishop to f4. And he had some other options instead of knight to or bishop to f4. I really like pawn to a3. Put your opponent to the test and says, even if you're not even 100% sure what your opponent's going to do, it kind of forces their hand. You don't want them to get too much material involved before you figure it out. So this kind of says, okay, you need to move your knight, capture something, let's do something. So if we can say knight takes on b3, we capture. Pawn to f6, forcing the knight to move. Knight comes back here to c6. I think white's going to be in a particularly okay position. He's up a pawn of material, isolated pawn in the center of the board. All in all, I think this is fine. But Karjakin decides to go and bring his bishop out here to f4, centralized. Knight takes on b3. And this was the first move that Magnus Carlsen took more than 7 seconds in the game. It took about 4 minutes. It's not too long. But we see the pawn recapture here. And then pawn down here to c5, and he had some other options as well here. He could have played queen to d4, pretty aggressive line. You could see bishop to g3 since it was being attacked. Rook over here to e8, just adding pressure in the center of the board. Knight d4, f5 if we really want to get crazy for Magnus Carlsen. c3, forcing one of these pieces to move. Queen here to d5. Could see the pawn capture, bishop down here to b4, and we start to see some fireworks. I think this would have been very entertaining to see. But we see pawn to c5, nonetheless, opening up the door more for a queenside attack from Magnus Carlsen. And the knight to e4. And this is kind of where Karjakin actually started to use a little bit of time. He didn't seem flustered at all. Seemed like he was prepared. But this was the first time that he didn't use maybe 5 to 6 seconds in the game. Pawn to f6 from Magnus Carlsen. Pawn or knight back here to f3 since it was under attack. Knight to f5, forcing the knight to move. Knight back here to g5. And then we do see a capture. Knight takes on g5. Pawn to h6, forcing the knight to move. The knight really only has one place to go. It doesn't want to come back here to, let's say, f3, because then the bishop could just take here. And then if the pawn takes, well, that's kind of bad because just queen down here to h4. There's double pawns on the f file. A lot of things are under attack. The bishop, the pawn. things go very bad for white here. If he takes with his queen, okay, well, then all of a sudden the knight comes down, takes on c2, gets that material back, but now he has a very strong attack, attacking both of these rooks right here. So if we look at where the knight can really move to, that's kind of it. Other than that, it's going to be taken immediately. So it comes here to e6, attacking both the queen and the rook. It really, Magnus Carlsen only has one move, and that's queen to d5. Anything else really is somewhat bad. And now the knight can't really take here on f8 because he would really decide it's better not to get checkmated here on g2. So he decides to go and play pawn to f3, stopping that attack. It's always important to know how you're blocking, because instead of f3, if he tried queen to f3 per se, then all of a sudden the queen takes, the pawn takes, and as we said before, knight down here to c2 gets a little bit tricky. Even if the knight takes on f8, it's still kind of bad. The rook over here to f8, still attacking both of these rooks right here. Not going to go very well for white. So instead decides to block correctly, pawn to f3, rook to e8, just attacking the center of the board, especially putting pressure on the knights here. Rook up here to e5, so Karjakin decides to play a little bit more aggressive and start to attack the center of the board. Queen back here to d6, c3, forcing the knight to move. This comes over here to e6 and says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and take a material. We can start to exchange on board. I'm going to take your knight. Sergei Karjakin says, I'm going to take your rook first. We can start to see some exchange on board. And after the pawns take, rook over here to c1, trying to control this open file here on the c file. Rook to c8, we do see an exchange on board. Both sides seem very, very okay with exchange of material because they are moving at a blistering pace here. Queen to e1, they're not just getting into any crazy positions, which I think is somewhat disappointing in game 6. But alas, here we are. Queen to d7, king up here to h2, because instead of, this queen here on e1 is attacking this pawn here. So he could have tried something, queen to c5, protecting this pawn, check. Instead, he decides to go and play the queen to d7. Hey, if you want to take my material here, I'll go and take your material here on d3. We can exchange. So after queen to d7, king up here to h2, pawn to a5, queen to e3, bishop down here, d5, queen up here to b6. Both sides just say, hey, if you want to go ahead and take a material here on b3, that's fine. I'll take material back. We do start to actually see some of that exchange. Queen takes here on a5, queen down here to d3. After the queen takes on b4, bishop to e6, they decide to go ahead and draw the game. Not a ton of material left to really do too much, especially with the opposite color bishops. It's going to be fairly drawish the rest of the way. 32 moves from each player. Magnus Carlsen only used about 30-ish minutes in the game. Karjakin a little bit more, played about an hour or so. So all in all, very, very quick game. Nothing too crazy. It almost seemed like Magnus Carlsen came out and said, I'm going to try something a little bit different we haven't seen so far. Karjakin responded with, hey, I've done my preparation for this. We're not going to get any crazy situations that I'm not familiar with. Magnus Carlsen decided to back off a little bit and said, okay, you are up a pawn in material. If you're not going to fall for any of this, I'm not going to do anything too crazy. Let's exchange a material. Let's get to move 30. We're on move 32 right now. And then we'll just go ahead and have a draw, get to the weekend. That's what I kind of think happened. But game number 6, we do have a draw. 6 draws in 6 games. So we do have a break tomorrow. And then we come back. Sergei Karjakin actually will be playing the white pieces again. So they kind of switch. Magnus Carlsen started in game 1. He will also be playing the white pieces in game 12 if it does get to that point. So Karjakin, game 7 in 2 days. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this tournament so far. Hopefully we can get some wins from someone, maybe a little more complicated positions as well. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.